Hi. Today, we're going to take a look at Jean Luen Yang's American-born Chinese and Vera Brosgol's Anya's Ghost, two graphic novels that deal with the theme of being fresh off the boat. And we want to explore in particular the Americanization process as explored within these two critically acclaimed and award-winning graphic novels. Now, one concept that often comes up in multi-ethnic literature is that of the fob, fresh off the boat. This concept shows up either directly or indirectly in a variety of multi-ethnic sources and appears to be an issue of anxiety for many first and second generation immigrants. And although there's a gross tendency to lump immigrants together, as we often see that happens with many of our, ESL students in public schools and, even in higher education, it's particularly interesting that this exact phrase shows up in the literature of many different ethnic groups and appears to be some sort of shared experience. And while the concept isn't new and it has been explored in more traditional forms of literature, it is beginning to make its way into another form of kind of recently accepted literature, comics and graphic novels. As an emerging form of literature within the last 50 to 75 years, it's interesting to see how this particular theme is presented, compared to its earlier treatments in more traditional forms of lit. Vera Brosgol's 2011 graphic novel, Anya's Ghost, participates in the dialogue surrounding the existence of and the anxiety over being a fob. Of course, one can't overlook the process of Americanization in graphic novels, without looking at Jean Luen Yang's American-born Chinese, one of the most well-known examples of a graphic novel that weaves the anxieties of an immigrant family and avoiding the stigma of being a fob into its story. Excuse me. Now, the term fob is still, relatively new in terms of American English lexicon, although its meaning is not. It stands for fresh off the boat, and it's used as a sort of slang, often derogatory in nature, to refer to immigrants and their families in a broader sense. More specifically, it's generally used to mark individuals who have not completely assimilated into American culture, become Americanized. And therefore, they stand out as a result of, their adherence to their cultural heritage. However, it's worth noting, there is also a movement to reclaim, or at the very least, disarm these terms through their use by those who are marked. Salman Rushdie, for example, states, and I quote, "To turn insults into strengths, Whigs, Tories, blacks all chose to wear with pride the names they were given in scorn," end quote. Now, while the validity of and the debate over the reclamation and use of these highly charged and often problematic at best terms continues, it is worth looking at the Americanization process of assimilation that many immigrants face upon their arrival to the United States, as well as the generation of their family members who follow. Jump ahead here. There we go. Now, for many generations, the United States, has perpetuated this romantic notion of it being a great melting pot where people of different cultures, ethnicities, races, religions, economic classes, and all other backgrounds all come together to form a sort of collective American identity. The first, usage of that really held from 1782, letters from an American farmer from J. Hector Saint Jean de Quevecoeur. I know I'm mispronouncing that, and I apologize. My French isn't very good. But from his letters where he said, individuals of all nations are melted into a new race of men. It's where we start to kind of see this concept of the melting pot come together. Later, at the turn of the 20th century, in particular 1908, we find Israel Zangwill in his play, The Melting Pot, refers to individuals of all nations are melted again into that new race. We have that concept coming back together of people blending into a new, series of countrymen and women. Now, although this may seem inclusive and appealing to some, the reality proved that the process could prove traumatizing for many who were boiled in the pot, often leaving newcomers in a difficult position of whether they're going to forsake their culture, their country of origin, for their new homeland, or are they going to face living a marginalized life? Even those who chose to assimilation were not guaranteed full status in this land of opportunity. Werner Sollers, for example, discusses this concept when he quotes Malcolm X, who said, and I quote, "I was born, I've lived, and I have been made over. Is it not time to write my life's story?" The idea here that Malcolm X is getting to is that the individual is converted to the, quote, saving grace of the American future, and thereby reject the adversity of the adversary of ethnicity. The idea of the adversary of ethnicity being that somehow it's problematic to be different. And it's not. When do they get to tell their story within this context of the United States? Although, many contemporary readers might balk at the idea of a dichotomous fallacy of this nature, this was nonetheless a choice that many people had to make upon arrival in this country, and many still do as they continue to seek social acceptance, even if many, other citizens here who've been here for many generations, removed from their ancestors' arrival, don't experience that process anymore. Now, in her article, Immigration, Citizenship, Racialization, and the Asian American Critique, Lisa Lowe documents a number of ways in which Asian Americans have, and I'm quoting here, serve as a complex site on which the manifold anxieties of the U.S. nation state have been figured. It's a pretty complicated concept, but the idea here is moving from the 19th century to the present day. Lowe looks at the tensions between the predominantly Anglo-European culture of the U.S. and how it has reacted to and responded to its Asian immigrant population. She suggests these responses have often served as Orientalist racializations, particularly during periods of domestic crisis of capital. The concept, again, being here, when the country, it deals with concepts of difficulty, economic challenge, you may find a majority who seeks to pin this on a minority and to scapegoat. And that's ultimately the argument that Lowe is making here. Now, she concludes that as a result of this history, Asian immigrants and Asian-born Americans have always, and I quote here, had always included a class formation and a gender formation that was determined, by the culture in which they sought to live. And so the idea then is that with this formation of class and gender lines, we shouldn't be that surprised then that there'd be further social lines drawn between those who were, quote, fresh off the boat and those who had successfully assimilated. Okay, so the idea again is that if there's a cultural expectation of a certain sort of behavior, all right, those who look different from the norm, right, they would be ostracized. And so if you're in that group that's being ostracized, then even within that group, it's going to further subdivide, right? Well, we're closer to the norm. You're not. You're different from us. All right. And even if you think about life in middle school, there's a lot of we're cool and we're not cool. You see a lot of that playing out in a weird sort of microcosm. So for Lowe and many Asian American critics, political emancipation through citizenship is never really an operation that's truly available to Asian Americans, Native Americans, African Americans, Chicanos, or any other non-white group. That's kind of Lowe's perspective on this, that just being a citizen alone doesn't guarantee you freedom from this process. Americanization is simply an illusion that reifies the segregation of peoples by ethnicities and race. The idea is it's a process that reinforces the different divides between one group as dominant and all of the others as foreign or secondary to that Anglo-American culture. As a result, this process, which may be invisible to many Caucasian Americans, suggests Lowe, is most often viewed as damaging and oppressive, for those who face it. In many regards, Americanization is simply a term that is a specialized form of inculcation unique to individuals assimilating or confronting life in an assimilated United States. Complex stuff. What does all that mean? What it's suggesting is that in order for people to move into the United States, they have to undergo this process whereby they let go of their cultural heritage in order to embrace this new culture of the Anglo-Caucasian, American dominant group, okay? And that's ultimately what Lowe is trying to suggest, and that it's not a process that is a forgiving process. It's a process that comes with costs, and ultimately is that true equal citizenship if one is made to sacrifice so much in order to simply avoid ostracization. So the 20th and 21st centuries open up some different, and new unconventional forms of literature, through comics and graphic novels. And that's kind of where my interest is today. And they allow opportunities for different voices to be heard and engage in these kind of complex discussions. And I think certainly, their ability to engage the reader through both textual and visual means enable them to cross to boundaries that, conventional novels and conventional writing doesn't always allow. As a result, I think this makes comics and graphic novels, an excellent vehicle for continuing this cross-culture discourse about, the experience of others. So first, we're going to dive into Anya's Ghost here and fitting in. Anya's Ghost is a graphic novel, as I mentioned, that was written and drawn by Vera Brosgol, and its central plotline focuses on an adolescent girl's encounter and eventual attempt to rid herself of a ghost that desired to manipulate her life and, in order to kind of live vicariously through Anya. And while the relationship begins innocently and amicably enough, it becomes clear the ghost's intentions are definitely not as honorable as the story progresses. And while Anya's Ghost may seem, initially to appear like a story of teen angst, suspense, and supernatural, kind of fitting with a middle-aged, young adult YA book, the graphic novel demonstrates the importance of recognizing value in one's immigrant culture and not blindly accepting cultural assimilation with open arms. At the end, Brosgol doesn't totally reject the possibility to find acceptance in the United States, but I think she does advocate for a blending of both Anya's native Russian culture with the new American life, and not really privileging one over the other, as we see what happens when there's this imbalance in her life. From the beginning of the story, the reader's initially introduced to the cultural conflict playing out in Anya's day-to-day life. She strives to be more American, while her mother maintains the old customs of Russia. We look at the first panels of the story, which open with her mother lovingly making a traditional Russian breakfast, as the children are preparing to go to school, and, Anya's complaining, oh, these things are so greasy. Can't we get low-fat Pop-Tarts? And although her mother reminds her that she used to love this meal, so it's something that she liked, she's now currently rejecting. We can see Anya's already on her way through this Americanization process with her desire to conform to the American boys, ideal image of what a girl should look like. And then she goes, oh boy, again with back in Russia, I don't think American boys really go for the girl that looks like rich men. She takes the food, but she then throws it out. And it's really interesting to me because I think in doing so, Brosgol's visual portrayal of Anya reflects a guilty expression as she literally rejects the food given to her by her mother. And I think that can be seen as emblematic of a greater rejection of her ethnicity as a Russian American. And it's something she seems to recognize as painful to some extent. This rejection is reinforced in a number of times, in Anya's complimentary of her mother when she asks Anya for help in studying for her citizenship test. Sure, Mom, I admire your dedication to democracy. Unfortunately, it's only under the context of Americanizing her mother that Anya is able to look favorably on her. Oop, I'm gonna back up one. Anya's initial encounter with Emily, the ghost, seems safe enough. So we see that, as the story gets underway, she seeks to find ways to help Anya in further assimilating her into American high school. Emily helps Anya with her homework, whispering the right things to say to encourage the boys to like her, as well as the dress the way American boys would like most. We hear her say, we hear Anya asking, like, if it's not too loose womany, and she says, I kind of feel slutty. These should be good indicators that this is not a good fit. And yet, Emily reminds her that this is what her research on American culture has shown as the way to get what one wants. And so Anya falls in line, at least temporarily. It's only after she's welcomed into the teen scene that Anya quickly realizes how unhappy these American girls are with the superficial culture that they've embraced, as the boys make their rounds with these quote-unquote loose womany girls. This is made most clear at the party Anya attends, where she finds a boy she likes is 2 and 3 timing his girlfriend, with her fully aware of this happening. She says, I can hear you thinking it, so go ahead and say it. Sure, he gets bad at parties, but I'm the one he's seen with. I'm the one people look at and know that's his girlfriend. Clearly, this Americanization process is one that transcends more than immigrants and their families, but also naturalized citizens as well, who have to continue to maintain the appearance of being American. Additionally, it speaks to the way it can subject young teens to playing roles that are damaging to all members involved in the act. Another aspect of the comic, I think, that's perhaps most poignant in highlighting this tension between American culture and one's ethnic heritage is seen in Anya's fellow Russian classmate, Dima. His diminutive nature is reflected in his name, and he seems to reflect the stereotypical traits one might expect of one who just, doesn't fit in with American high school setting. He's overly book smart, he's got big glasses, he's got a really bad haircut, he's overly eager to please his teachers, and he's not really able to understand the idioms of American English. And finally, he also maintains important cultural activities, such as his participation in the Russian Orthodox Church, all of which Anya clearly rejects, right? She says, God, what a little freak. Can you not see why it's not good for me to be seen with him? What Anya doesn't admit and can't seem to admit is that it's not good for her to be around Dima, because it forces her to recognize a part of herself that she's so desperate to forget. Emily confusedly asks Anya during lunch why she wouldn't stand up for Dima when he's being harassed, by a group of bullies. And she says, well, back when I was alive, your people were your family. You defended each other no matter what. And Anya, with a really kind of, dour look on her face, simply says, well, times have changed. You act like a fobby creep, you get creamed. And again, here we see this recurring notion of the fob is made explicit, and Anya's rejection of her Russian heritage is brought right out into the open. By the end of the story, however, Anya begins to recognize that Emily, her personal ghost, doesn't have her best intentions in mind. Instead, we find Emily's discovered to have been responsible for the murder of a young man who she loved, and the woman who she saw as a competitor after having bought into the patriarchal American dream of getting married and raising a family, and she fell out of it. She wasn't successful in pursuing that dream. So unable to deal with the rejection, she murders the couple, but she died in the wood, fleeing capture. So in some regards, she can kind of be seen to serve as a sort of ghost of patriarchy and Americanization that continues to haunt young girls and those attempting to fit into American culture, in her attempts to influence Anya into foregoing her own heritage and self-respect to be a part of society. Through Dima's assistance and support, however, Anya is finally able to shake free of Emily's influence and put the ghost to rest. But I think more important than ending the threat of the ghost, however, Anya comes to recognize how, she was really transferring a lot of her own self-hate and her own anxieties onto her fellow Russian Americans, such as her family and Dima, when she tells them, the only thing different about me now versus when I got some better clothes, the only difference about me now versus then is that I got some better clothes and got rid of my accent. You'll probably lose yours too, but even if you don't, this is just high school. Impressing a bunch of snooty teenagers is a pretty lame life goal to have. The facial expressions Brosgol draws clearly indicate that this message hit home for Dima. And it also serves to illustrate Anya's growth and acceptance, of both aspects of her life, the Russian heritage and her new American life. By the end of the novel, the ghost is put to rest, and Anya finds a place within her high school's, service learning program. Where earlier in the story, she lied about her name to sound more American. The novel ends with her proudly, correcting the principal and the pronunciation of Borskotskaya. By the end, Brosgol positions Anya and the reader to see that being both American and Russian are not mutually exclusive propositions after all. Now, Anya's Ghost could be misinterpreted again as a simple comic book, and below any kind of literary notice is Brosgol does adopt a more simple and cartoonish aesthetic to her art. And the storyline that she delivers is anything but simplistic. Her novel attempts to continue the discourse surrounding the difficulties many immigrants and their families experience assimilating and Americanizing themselves while still struggling to hold on to their own ethnic heritage and practices. So you can't disqualify, a story because it adopts a different approach that's not maybe traditionally seen as serious and often viewed as, mere entertainment and kids stuff. I think, what we see here is there's some different and exciting ways that, authors and artists are picking up this relevant and much needed discussion um, for new readers. Now, Anya's Ghost subtly weaves the concept of fob and the fresh off the boat and the struggle of Americanization into its story, coming of age story. Jean Luen Yang's award-winning American-born Chinese takes direct aim at the process of Americanization, fobs, and finding a balance between one's native and adopted cultures. Yang's story is especially deceptive as he makes use of a notable cartoonish art style, which, I think less careful readers can be fooled into not taking the story as seriously, maybe disregarding it as, mere child reading fodder. However, Yang expertly intertwines three separate story arcs of the Monkey King, Jin Wang, and Wei Chen Sun into a fictional television show starring the American teen Danny and his Chinese cousin Chinky. What's particularly compelling is the way that Yang, by the end of the novel, weaves all three of these seemingly divergent storylines together into one powerful conclusion that forces both Jin Wang and the reader to confront both Americanization and one's own ethnic heritage, and consider the possibility that one can be both American and Chinese without the exclusion of the other. As King Kok Chong states, there's a, quote, desire to reclaim a distinctive ethnic tradition that seems forever at odds with the desire to be fully American. Like Vera Brosgol, Jean Luen Yang seeks to look at this problem and suggest there's a potential for compromise. The first arc introduced is that of the Monkey King, and he undergoes a difficult journey to understand that being a monkey does not make him a lesser being. He spends a good deal of time learning new disciplines of Kung Fu that further empower him to demonstrate his physical prowess and mental acumen over all other deities. But he ends up becoming an unruly, destructive force who, despite his physical and mental superiority, has no spiritual balance. So as a punishment for his hubris, Siyo Tzu trapped the Monkey King under a large mountain of stone until he was willing to return to his normal monkey form and stop trying to be something he's not. Now, ultimately, this kind of sets the groundwork up for the struggle many immigrants may feel of trying to be something wholly American that they're not. They're not this image, this illusion. So this isn't to say that they can't be Americans, but the suggestion is that one does not have to totally refuse that part of him or herself that is, say, Chinese or Native American or Russian or African American in order to also be American. Now, the second storyline is perhaps one of the most visually uncomfortable for readers, as it simulates a sort of television sitcom portraying the day-to-day life of, quote, normal Caucasian teenage boy Danny, who suffers through the visit of his exchange student cousin from China, Chinky, obviously named after a racially charged epitaph for Asian Americans. And he's, again, that visual embodiment of all stereotypes against, Chinese and Asian people. Where we see Danny is kind of good-looking, blonde hair, blue-eyed, and generally nondescript from anywhere USA. Yang presents Chinky with yellow skin, slanted eyes, buck teeth. He's continually smiling, dresses in traditional Hanfu, and he spouts comments that, reinforce nearly every possible racist stereotype you could have ever heard about Asian people. His dialogue is peppered with, I'm just trying to think about this here, right? Any bad jokes that you may have ever heard, bad Kung Fu movies, items from a Chinese restaurant menu, and really his actions and words reflect the worst held beliefs that, many Westerners hold about people from Asian countries. We also see that arriving at Danny's house, Chinky meets a female friend and leeringly rushes over to her while salivating. And I quote, such pretty American girl with bountiful American bosom must bind feet and bear Chinky's children. Clearly, Chinky plays upon fears of Asian men marrying Caucasian women, as past state and federal laws illustrate such fears against misogyny. Further, Chinky demonstrates himself as an exceptional student, playing upon further stereotypes of the model immigrant. It is in this final arc of the story with Jin Wang's trials that this racist comedy of errors, however, comes to a close. Here, we see this final story arc, and it's one that's been blended in from the very beginning. It serves as the focal point around which the first two come to a head. Jin Wang, a young boy whose parents bring him to America at the age of 9, excuse me, and he experiences this firsthand, the difficulties of being a fob. We see that he tells an elder woman who inquires as to, what he wants to be when he grows up, and responds that he wants to be a transformer robot. That's more than meets the eye. And the woman responds in a way that the reader realizes there's more to what she says than what Jin hears, right? She tells him, it's easy to become anything you wish as long as you're willing to forfeit your soul. Yang continues to illustrate the different ways Jin's Chinese culture was misunderstood, out of and in the classroom. And we hear the teacher say, "I'm sure Jin doesn't do that," and referring to a question about eating a dog. In fact, Jin's family probably stopped that sort of thing as soon as they came to the United States. The implication is that his family did do these things, but they stopped once they arrived in the more civilized U.S. A second implication here is that by hearing this from a teacher, now a source of authority, knowledge, it seems to illustrate a more pervasiveness to this ignorant understanding of other cultures. Jin is not left as the sole Asian student in his school as the new boy, Wei Chen, arrives from Taiwan. Now, interestingly, Jin's immediate response to seeing Wei Chen was, and I quote, "There was something that made me want to beat him up," which perfectly illustrates what Chung earlier refers to as a reaction of American-born Asians who discriminated against so-called fobs. Although Jin and Wei Chen grow up to become friends, Jin's discomfiture with Wei Chen's continued display of Chinese mannerisms and culture is painfully obvious as he continually corrects his friend. He says, "You're in America, speak English." Even years later, Jin continues to act the part of the enforcer of Americanization to Wei Chen when he says, "This isn't Taiwan, you doof. Stop acting like a fob." Still, it's Wei Chen who gets the girl, is less socially awkward around others, and is generally at more peace with himself than his, quote, well-assimilated friend. Both Yang and Chung are in agreement with one another when Chung states, "Many people of Asian descent feel to this day the need to prove their Americanness by shedding their obligatory culture and by setting themselves apart from new Asian immigrants." Now, certainly, Yang's character of Jin illustrates this principle with each attempt to appear more American and less Chinese. And it's at the end of the story where these three seemingly different narrative threads come together as one and reinforce Chung's belief that a psychological sense of home is the most important sense of home. Their friendship, however, comes to an end when Jin's attitude boils over and he verbally attacks Wei Chen. Wei Chen says, "We're brother, Jin, we're blood." And Jin responds, "You've got to be kidding. You and I are nothing alike, and don't worry about your stupid girlfriend. She's not my type. Maybe I think she can do better than a fob like you." Again, that concept of fob coming back. Now, as Jin falls asleep that night, he dreams of the old woman to whom he told he wanted to become a transformer robot earlier. "So, little friend," she tells him, "you've done it." And in a violent and cruel, psychologically cruel manner, Jin certainly did transform himself into something very different from Wei Chen, but his uncertainty of what that thing is does not sit well with him. In a strange twist, Yang managed to merge the three plot lines together. We come to find that Danny is actually an image of being that Jin aspires to be. Chinky is actually the Monkey King who was sent by Cao Yao Tzu to serve as Jin's conscience and confront him with his own self-hating, racist attitudes towards his own people. And it turns out that Wei Chen was on a quest of his own as the disguised son of the Monkey King to learn about life as a human. In a way not dissimilar from the Monkey King's trial of coming to accept his true form to free himself from under the mountain of stone, So too does Jin have to learn how to accept himself as Jin and not as the desired Danny persona, so that he can free himself from his own mountain, but this one of self-hate instead of stone, from which he buried himself under. And this is accomplished really through reaching out to the Monkey King's son, Wei Chen, and rebuilding his broken relationship. And this is really emblematic of Jin's final acceptance of his Chinese heritage and culture through accepting friends who share those values. So, although Anya's Ghost and American-born Chinese could be misinterpreted as simple comic books and below any kind of literary tensions, because of the more simple and cartoonish aesthetics used in these stories, the storylines each creator delivers are anything but simplistic. They both attempt to continue this discussion about the ways in which the difficulties immigrants and their children experience in assimilating and Americanizing themselves, while still trying to struggle and hold on to their own ethnic heritages and practices. And at the end of the day, that's the kind of story that I think is worth consideration and is worth taking a look at. On a final note, one of the difficulties I encountered while exploring multi-ethnic perspectives on the FOB, the Fresh Off the Boat, was the challenge of finding multi-ethnic women creators who work in the field of comics as a medium, particularly those who identified as being in a multi-ethnic background. The journey of first immigrants to the United States and the struggle they and their children face and finding balance between their competing cultural heritage is one that's not going to go away anytime soon. It's one that still continues to be at the forefront, of discussions today as a society. And so, I think, having comics like this, continuing to tell these stories to increase involvement in developing, these kind of stories is going to help, I think, everyone. So if you have any further questions, I hope this was of interest to you. But there's some further readings here you can take a look at, and I'll unpack a little bit about what I've referenced so far in this discussion as it pertains to the Americanization process that I see taking place within these two graphic novels. Thanks for listening, and be well.